They get a minion yesterday?
Yeah,
Good, good.
yeah,
I worry.
yeah. We had a nice minion.
I worry.
I hear you. We had a nice minion.
So I thought that was really good. Yeah, because you know, my kids were in Israel, so all my that's how they're in Egyptian war.
Okay. Okay.
Thank God for, if I even have taken for any, like, you talked to them. So I think. When I heard.
Many people walking around out there with backpacks and hoodies to not be vigilant.
We got, they got extra security today.
I noticed that.
Yeah.
I see my daughter.
Okay. I think we're, just about ready.
Notable leader.
No, thank God, we have never been,
Either is-
there's rockets every day. in this world. Right. But, thank God they've never been able to get to your sheet. I'm sorry, anyone.
A lot of fine print in here.
A lot of fine print.
Is that to confuse us?
Yeah, just to make sure you brought your readers. All right. So it's been a long time since we've done this. I don't think we've done this since the new year, right? So
We are ready, John.
Does anybody remember what we were talking about? So we brought this verse from Deuteronomy that says, Vayada'ata yom v'ashavos el levavecha, that you shall know today and place it upon your heart that Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei Adonai, is Elohim, Ein Od, and there is nothing else. And we went through the whole very involved, very detailed talk about the ways in which Hashem, Havaya, or either one of those two, right? The Yud Kei Vav Kei, the infinite expression of God, the transcendent element, how it relates to the Elohim reality, to the constrained reality, to the confined reality, and how these are two modes in which God relates, two modes in which God manifests, and they interplay with each other. And we said that from the outside, it sort of looks like Elohim obfuscates Havaya, right? That there is a process that covers, there is an expressive process and then a concealing process, and they are linear. One works against or in succession to the other. And then we said, so that was the sort of the classic understanding that we had. But then we said that the Zohar, the mystical tradition, tells us that kul echad, that they're all one, which means they work in tandem. They're not opposite effects. And so then we went through that whole really involved discussion about analogies and the function of analogies, and we used the analogy of a rabbi, a teacher, and a student as the student receiving an analogy from the teacher, and that entire analogy being analogous to this relationship of Havaya and Elohim, of Hashem and Elohim. And all of this was to say, all of this brought us to the discussion about tests, right? About being in a place where godliness seems to be obfuscated, to being in a place of darkness where we're uncertain what's going on, right? Which I'm sure all of us can relate to right now. And I was saying on Wednesday night we have our Parsha class, and we know that nothing is by coincidence and nothing is by happenstance. So on Wednesday night, we were learning the first Parsha of the Torah, which is Bereshis, and the first Rashi on the first Parsha of the Torah talks all about the Jews' claim to Israel and how the non-Jews are going to challenge it and how the non-Jews historically challenge it, and that our claim to Israel is for no other reason other than God created the world and he gave it to us. And that's the beginning and the end of the discussion. So in the same vein that nothing is by happenstance and nothing is by coincidence, so we one of the first questions we asked when we brought this verse was that this verse is in context to going into the land of Israel. And it's almost a prerequisite. The Torah has as almost a prerequisite for going into the land of Israel. So we're finally going to circle back around in some sort of roundabout type of way, which this mimer likes to do. But we're going to start addressing that. How does this whole concept of being able to transcend tests, knowing godliness is present even in its obfuscation, all of these elements, how does this relate to entering into the land of Israel? And with that also, we're going to address the concept of Dar Haflaga. Dar Haflaga means the generation of separation or the generation of fragmentation. And it is the generation that came after the flood, which happens to be this week's Parsha. We started Parshas Noach, the portion of Noah. We started today. It's the second Parsha in the Torah. So the Noah story, I'm sure we all know, at least in the Cliff Notes version, that Noah was a good guy and everybody else was pretty rotten. And Hashem said, I want a do-over. So he made a do-over and he made a flood. And Noah was on the Teva, on the ship, on the ark. And then after the flood, they repopulated the earth. They started over again, right? They had their do-over. Morning. And then the Torah tells us in the final Aliyah that there was one nation or one culture. What people were singular. Everybody spoke the same language, though, the same culture. They were all essentially family, right? Because there was only a couple of generations since they all came from Noah. And they decide to build this tower, right? The Tower of Babel. And God is not happy with it. And so the generation that put that all together is called Dar Haflaga, and we're going to explore that. So we are on page 207. And we're going to try to answer some of these questions. I would say that we are technically in the home stretch. I know this has been a long summer of learning this discourse. And it's still a hefty packet that's in front of you, so it might not feel like the home stretch, but I think we're going to move pretty fast through this part. We're on page 207. So we have to understand, we have this verse that tells us that Havaya is Elikim. We have this verse that tells us that the two modalities by which or through which God presents, right? These two ways of expression, these two modes of relation from our perspective of how God is present in our life are represented by Havaya, the infinite, the transcendent, and Elikim, the concealed. And the Torah tells us they're one and the same. And this is connected with leaving Egypt and going into Israel. That is in fact facilitated by the leaving of Egypt, right? Leaving Egypt, we know spiritually, is about transcending our limitations. Mitzrayim is the word for Egypt in Hebrew, and Mitzrayim linguistically is connected with the word Meitzarim, which means limitations. It means constrictions or constraints or the straits, the narrows. Our capacity to break free of that which is holding us back is the spiritual process of leaving Egypt that we all go through, right? That's something that we do. That's why the Talmud tells us every generation we have to see ourselves as having left Egypt. In the same way, we say every day we have to leave Egypt. Every day we have to push ourselves to grow a little more, to transcend our limitations a little more. So all of this facilitates what it means to understand Havaya is Elikim. Continuing on page 208. The Arizal, who we've mentioned the Arizal before. The Arizal, I like to say, is the Michael Jordan of Kabbalah. We have 2,000 years of Kabbalah history, and the Arizal lived in the 1500s. And when the Arizal came around, he was so radical in the study of Kabbalah that it immediately became that the entire period, the entire 1500 years before he lived, was now one period in Kabbalah, and the entire period after was now post-Arizal Kabbalah. He changed it so radically that it was all determined as pre and post Arizal at that point. So he taught in Pri Chaim that Yisrael hayu b'shiba Mitzrayim hayu gilgul and neshama shel daraflaga, that we have a spiritual concept called Gilgul, which is reincarnation, or there's another fancy word. It's like transference, I think. It is some element in which souls of a previous generation are recycled into souls of a new generation. The Rebbe would often say that, I don't know often, but the Rebbe mentioned a couple of times that the women, that our generation is connected with the generation that left Egypt. Whether that's a Gilgul or not, I'm not entirely sure, but we at least share a characteristic, or we share an ethos. But the Arizal was somebody who was really into Gilgul, really into this concept of reincarnation. And he actually wrote a book called, well, he didn't write any books, but he dictated books to his students. He wrote a book called Shara Gilgulim, which is all devoted to reincarnations. And he'll say that Adam was reincarnated as Judah, who was reincarnated as David, and he'll go through like all generations from the Bible through the Talmud era, and say that like this person is a reincarnation of this person. And I don't entirely understand what it means. I would say I generally don't understand what it means, but I think in some way we can conceive of the fact that the generation of Daraflaga, this generation that built this tower as this expression right after the flood, this expression of their own existence, and the challenges that the Jewish people leaving Egypt faced, there's some dovetail there, right? There's some relationship. How does that Arizal see it? So what the Arizal says is that the Dor HaFlaga, the generation that made the Tower of Babel, so they built this tower with stones, right? It was this expression of their own, we would say their own yeshus, their own sense of self, right? It was this like ego expression that they were going to build a tower that was going to reach to the heavens, right? So in Lurianic Kabbalah, in the Arizal's system, there's this concept called tikkun, right? Have we heard of tikkun olam? It's the same idea. Tikkun olam is to fix the world, right? Is to make the world a better place. So tikkun means to fix. So in this system, everything is, or things can be a tikkun for something else, right? There was the Dor HaFlaga was misguided in how they built the tower, and so the Jewish people, when they were enslaved in Egypt, them building the pyramids was a way to like rectify that energy in a more aligned way, in a proper way, to process it in a way that becomes integrated, that it becomes uplifted. Whereas the Dor HaFlaga, the Tower of Babel, contradicts our relationship with God, right? It undermines our relationship with God. It's trying to assert our own existence, trying to level the playing field almost between us and God, right? Saying that we're as significant as God is. So the slavery that the Jewish people faced on the other hand of that spectrum, building the pyramids as this or maybe not the pyramids, but whatever they built, building that with the same materials is that tikkun, is that rectification of that previously misguided deal. And he says that it had to come about in a way that first you have to have daraflaga, you have to have this darkness first, you have to have this misguided deal first, that could then be rectified. So we refer to this generation that built the Tower of Babel as Dar HaFlaga, which is a peculiar word. And so traditionally we understand it to mean that it's like almost not even Hebrew, really. It's like almost sort of Aramaic. But plugsa means a disagreement or a separation, a fragmentation. So what was the distinction? What was the fragmentation that they made? That they fragmented between Havaya and Elikim, right? We've been saying this whole time how they're all one and trying to push ourselves to see the synergy between the two of them, right? That God has these two modalities in relating, or we perceive God as having two modalities in how he relates to us, right? And we're trying to unify them to say that they're not opposite forces, but rather they work as one entity, and that concealment is also a revelation, right? That concealment is also a process of expression, not that it conceals the expression. The idea of establishing their own existence, of presenting themselves as a yesh, as a thing, all of that was separating between Havaya and Ikim, separating between God's transcendent expression and God's finite expression, God's concealed expression. How do we see that? The Indian Hapirud Huk Shecheshev Shehashem Elikim Masner Chasashon Be'emes Al Shem Havaya. We're continuing on page 209. The separation, the distinction to make is that when one thinks that there is a process of concealment that works independently from a process of expression. Which actually is creates almost a type of deist mentality or a deist perspective, a notion that God in his essence is removed from the world and is uninterested or uninvolved, and that there is only the concealment of God's essence is what is facilitating existence, right? If we remember, I know it's been a long time, but if we remember, we said that Elohim, the name for God that we use, which signifies the concealment and the constraint, the obfuscation of godliness, is the same numerical value as hatava, as nature. And right, we said that the natural order, the natural system, in some ways sort of conceals the divinity, right? It conceals godliness. There is a way in which, in its concealment, it also expresses godliness. That's how the sun, rises in the east and sets in the west every day, and how a day is a 24-hour period, right? Those types of things that we can, in the consistency of the natural order, we can attribute as, we can sort of see as a divine element. But in a lot of ways also, right, the world presents itself as a very cold, very dog-eat-dog, survival of the fittest type of place, not a warm and fuzzy godly place, right? So that concealment is all Elohim. We could say that the separation that they're making is to not see godliness in anything, is to see only Elohim, is to see only the natural order sort of running as it runs, and all of that is to divorce Havaya from Elohim. All of that is to create that separation, and within that separation, creating that separation allows for our own sense of self, right? If we live in a dog-eat-dog world, if we live in a world of evolution, of survival of the fittest, then we're something. We're our own person who has to be the most fit, right? There's that rat race at that point. So what it creates for a person who lives in this mentality is to see the concealment as the be all and end all, right? That this world is just a physical world, and that's the beginning and the end of the conversation. That we live in a rat race, and so you have to screw over your neighbor to get ahead, right? Like we mentioned before we took the break for Tishrei about when we were talking about tests, right? That was the last conversation we had, was about the tests that we experience, the challenges that we face. And that living in a reality in which Havaya is Elikim, living in a reality in which God's infinity, God's transcendence, God's total magnitude is present within this physical world, is one in which we're no longer compelled to screw over our neighbor to get ahead, because we're at that point, we're along for the ride, right? We're just embracing God's beauty. But if we don't live with that reality, then the Dara Flaga, the idea of divorcing the two, of building this tower, of asserting our own individuality, disconnected our own ego, that is disconnected from godliness, that is the conclusion, that is the ultimate realization of that mistake. And so what it causes is it becomes almost circular, and it further disconnects us from godliness. On the top of page 210, and this is in direct opposition to the singular reality that unifies Havaya and Elikim, right? To recognize that there are two forces, that we perceive God's relationship in the Havaya way, in the expressive, infinite manner, and then also in the concealed manner. So when we unify those, then we live in a harmonious reality. And when we have this Dara Flaga mentality, so that is that the divorce of those two, the separation of those two, makes us live in this opposite state. But the true reality is to come to the appreciation that all of the hesterim, all of the concealment, is not in a response to expression, but rather it facilitates expression. The concealment, that is the ways in which we don't actively perceive God, the ways in which we have to work to perceive God, is not there to conceal something that is revealed, but is rather a tool that facilitates greater revelation. This was the very lengthy metaphor we gave about the student and the teacher conveying information to the student in a way that maybe from an outside perspective might look as a concealment. It might look that he's only presenting certain elements of the information to the student, and then the student has to sort of extrapolate more and work to pull out, to flesh out more information. But we said that the fact that for the teacher it is being conveyed in a way in its entirety, and it only presents as being concealed for the student, but the fact that it's conveyed in its entirety and the student can ultimately realize it in its entirety means that it's not actually concealed for anybody. It's just from an outside perspective, at face value, it presents as concealed, but it's ultimately all there. And if it's not concealed for the teacher, that means it's not concealed for the student. That was our conclusion from that whole long, weeks long conversation we had about the teacher and the student. So the concealment, the analogy that the teacher uses in order to facilitate the student's comprehension, even though it might seem even disconnected from the material at hand, and certainly presents as a concealment, presents as obfuscating the information itself, actually facilitates more understanding, right? The way that the language that we're using, that it goes lower, that it becomes more magusha, more crass, more physicalized, more tangible in some way. And that while the analogy might seem disconnected, it might seem foreign to the actual information, to the actual concept itself, what it facilitates is a further comprehension, a deeper understanding, because it becomes more accessible at that point. Does that call Inyan elements of Esterim? And this is in fact the whole purpose of why there is concealment, right? Why we are able to work in this fashion, right? When we share ideas, when we convey ideas, the fact that we're able to use analogies and examples is part of the same idea. It helps us to further illustrate our point. And in the same way, on a much grander scale, God uses it in the same way to allow godliness to be apparent in a way that is more effective than just overt godliness, right? if there is just overt godliness, then we stop being us. There's no room for us to be us, right? Because we can't be finite in the face of infinity. Finite and infinity don't relate to each other. Infinity consumes finitude. The concealment allows for our own finitude, that we can, in our limited state, realize something infinite. We can in some ways catch a glimpse of it. Without calling in Lamas in a state, and Bichdei Lahavi Liglis is her, Bichanal Ba'erch Ba'erch, B'mashal Dashpas Harabel Talmud, Shekol Hatzimtzum Valbashas B'meshim, Zarim Ben Yonim Shenim Hakol Hu Bichdei Lavi Ligili Ur Aseichel Harav El HaTalmud, right? That the entire system of metaphors, like we said, and the analogies, while they are foreign to the concept itself, right? We said that we might be talking about that we're talking about sophisticated algebra, but we're using apples and oranges as an example for that. So the algebra doesn't actually relate to apples and oranges in any way. They're two totally foreign entities, foreign concepts, but the relationship, being able to use one in place of the other or in the other's stead, allows us to further express a point that otherwise would be much more abstract, would be harder to conceive of, would be harder to comprehend. And that's ultimately the entire purpose. And we said that like the Talmud tells us that after 40 years, the student can attain the same mastery over the concept like the teacher has, that when a proper analogy is created and given over, is transmitted, in which it contains all the information, so the student can wrestle with it and digest it, and after 40 years, come to at least can come to the same ownership, the same mastery over the concept as the teacher had in conveying it to the student. And we said these are two different modalities that in Kabbalah is referred to as Ar Yashar, the straight light, and Ar Chozer, the reflected light. Ar Yashar is the straight light, is the way it is for the teacher, that he just understands it, right? He has his own mastery over the concept, over the information. And the Ar Chozer, the reflected light, is for the student, where it descends, the concept descends to the lowest, into the analogy, into a foreign expression that is technically unrelated to the concept itself. But that bounces back, it allows it to come back up, that the student can ultimately develop the same amount of, he can ascertain the same mastery and comprehension that his teacher had in disseminating the information. And those two modalities are how godliness relates to the world. There's the overt expression of godliness that we perceive, and there is the reflected, afterwards, now I see that the God was present in this moment. Or now that I sort of shifted my perspective and I really worked to develop how I see, how I conceive of my existence, now I'm able to perceive some godliness in those challenges that I was experiencing. The same is true of God. That when we talk about the divine light, which we say is light is the metaphor that the Kabbalists like for energy. So when we talk about the effusion of divine energy or divine light, there is a system that conceals it. And in the system that conceals it, it ultimately is facilitating us to realize godliness in a more robust way. That if it was just God, if it was just expression, we wouldn't be able to receive that. We wouldn't be us and able to receive that. We would stop being us. And so because of that, because the system in place is meant to be one in which us in our finite space, in our finite existence, can realize something divine, can realize something godly. So being able to do that is set up through this process of obfuscation, through this process of concealment. And it allows us to do Torah, to learn Torah and to do mitzvot, to engage with the divine, to engage with the infinite within our finite experience. Right, as we mentioned before, this is the paradox of what it means to be a Jewish person, that we're in this finite world, and we're in a finite body, and yet we're a soul that is an extension of the infinite. And every mitzvah that we do is helps us to catch a glimpse and to in some ways brush shoulders with the infinite, right? To grasp in some ways the infinite. Ultimately, we brought early in this discourse, we brought the idea from the Vayada'ata Kodesh, which is an old Kabbalistic work, which said that just like God has to have a capacity for infinity, he has to have a capacity for finitude, right? To be truly infinite means that you can't exist in the bifurcation, the duality of either infinite or finite, right? If God is truly Ein Sof, truly limitless, then he has to have a capacity to present as infinite or to relate as infinite and to relate as finite. So we said the infinite God makes sense, right? That's easy to conceive of. God's infinite. That's like, it's like on his business card. But the finite, that's a lot harder to conceive of. What's the finite expression of God is us, right? We are that finite expression. Each one of us is created b'tselem Elokim in God's image, and we are the finite that is interfacing with the infinite. So the entire system, of obfuscation, of the concealment, the fact that we don't perceive God in the table or in the bagel is all there in order that it's hidden in that way, in order that we can be our own finite self, but ultimately engage with some divinity, ultimately engage with some infinity.
On page 209,
Yeah.
it says, "Don't be afraid of the dark." So that's pretty much explaining that sometimes the light is so great that to diminish it gives us the opportunity to see.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
And that's what it says here.
Exactly.
Don't be afraid of the
Yeah.
dark.
Yeah, the whole system of concealment is helps us to be the perceiver, right? Right. It allows our own perception to take place. The last paragraph on tune 10. And there is, in fact, and this was a meditation that we mentioned previously. It was definitely a while ago, but I remember that we were studying upstairs when we saw it, which was that one of the meditations that really comes out from this discourse, one of the things I think I mentioned before as an aside, this discourse, it's called, I don't think you have the title page, but we refer to it as Vayada'ata Moskova. Moskova is Moscow, and it was because it was said in Moscow. Vayada'ata is the first word of the verse, and you should know. And there's a tradition amongst the Chabad rabbis, that each Rebbe had a discourse that he would say regularly. And the tradition was that they would say it to purify the air, whatever that means. I don't think it had to do with, carbon offsetting, right? It was a spiritual endeavor, but that they would have these discourses that they would say regularly to purify the air, to purify the space, to bring some alignment and some conscientiousness, some spiritual consciousness into their setting. And so for the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Rebbe, who was the author of this discourse, this was his air purifier. This was his HEPA filter. So if we notice on the bottom in the gray bar where the page is, there's days. It says day 21. So I took this from a book where they set it up that each day has like a short study, because this is one of the discourses that in Chabad, people will return to often and meditate on extensively. So one of the meditations that we learned when we were learning upstairs was that there is a recognition that in as much as there is a system here that has expression and concealment and Havaya and Elokim, we have to also at the same time be able to in some ways push our mind to perceive the fact that God's essence is present in this space right now. As difficult as that might be, recognizing that we have physical eyes and we live in a physical world, and recognizing that everything that we learn about the system of revelation and concealment and them working in tandem or opposite each other or wherever we're holding in the discourse, sometimes it's hard to conceive of that, but that ultimately the purpose is to realize that at every moment, God's essence is present here now in its entire infinite magnitude, in its entire magnitude that transcends the dichotomy of infinite and finite. And the work of reflecting on something like this, on Havaya is Elikim, that infinite is not constrained by finite, that expression is not obfuscated by concealment, but rather that all of this is working in tandem, is to be able to be present in this moment, to recognize God's essence as here now, and to recognize that the system of Torah and mitzvahs is what helps us to connect to that. That Torah and mitzvahs is the vehicle, or are the vehicles through which we can realize that and through which we can connect to God's essence. And it helps us to realize nothing can get in the way, nothing can obfuscate us, nothing can separate us from God. Nothing can separate us from godliness. That we can attain a conscious, a sensitivity to be present to God's, to be aware of God's presence here and now, and that nothing can get in the way of that. The email lomis aimed leneged connectum. So you might say that if Torah and mitzvahs is the vehicle through which I can realize my relationship with God, Torah and mitzvahs is the way in which I can go out of I can transcend my limitations and perceive more godliness in the world, in my own life. So then what happens when I'm being challenged, when I'm trying to do a mitzvah and somebody's challenging me, when I'm trying to go out of my comfort zone, when I'm trying to realize more divinity in the world, and there's something that's blocking me from doing that, right? What do I do at that point? That would seem like something's getting in the way of my relationship with God, right? There's traffic and I'm trying to go to shul, right? Or whatever, right? Fill in the blank, right? And the most extreme would be that a person saying that a person has a gun to his head and says, do X, Y, or Z, serve idols or else, right? And we can imagine what the else is, right? So when we talk about an idea like Mesiras Nefesh, which is this concept of self-sacrifice, I'm meditating on the fact that all of us have, red lines. We have lines in the sand where for us and our relationship with God, we won't cross, right? And reflecting on what those are. That's a very real mental exercise. It's a very powerful mental exercise to realize that there is something that I am ready to die for in my relationship with God. And that if I have the guts and I'm square enough with myself to meditate on that and to reflect on that, not in the actual time of when it's going on, but just in my own free time, in my own moments of connection, that makes my relationship with God a lot more real. The more I can ascertain where are my lines in the sand, what are my red lines that I won't cross, the more I'm able to really grasp that, and I'm able to see for myself what that is. How much more real does that make our relationship with God? That I know that there's something that I would give my life up for, not in an abstract theoretical way, but conceiving in a real concrete, practical, tangible way, that there's something that I'm so committed to that it's even worth my life, right? So all of that is to recognize that even in the moments where we feel challenged, where we feel like we want to connect, but there's something hindering our capacity for connection, there's something in the way of our connection, all of that only helps us to realize further how much greater the connection can be, right? Like we said, this idea that when we talk about the concept of challenges or tests, that these tests that get in the way that might try to undermine our relationship with God, what they ultimately allow for is a much deeper appreciation for that relationship. Amnam, continuing on page 216. Amnam inyan afloga shemafrid chas v'shalom zo hepach l'gamrei. So we see now that to separate Havaya and Elikim is the total opposite of that, right? Separating Havaya and Elikim is saying that God's infinity, God's essence is disconnected from the finite reality that I live in here and now. That the physical world that presents itself as this dog eat dog evolutionary reality is the be all and end all, and that removes God's infinity, God's magnitude from the equation. And this is what it means. They use a peculiar expression when they say that we're going to build ourselves this tower, right? They say we're going to build a tower for nice alonu shem, and we're going to make for ourselves a name, right? It's an expression we use even in English, right? He made a name for himself, right? He like really established himself as a somebody, right? So this goes back all the way to the Torah, the same idea that making a name for oneself has this similar connotation of a like we talk about. There's an expression of blitus. Blitus means to stick out. Like in Chabad, we talk about blitus as like the ultimate, like we're allergic to blitus. Like you don't want to stick out. You don't want to like make yourself the focal point and like show off that you're like doing, that you're davening with so much more intention, right? Or you're doing a mitzvah with so much more seriousness, with so much more awareness. Like just, like we have a sort of communist bend to us in that. So like everybody should just fall in line and like, you're not better than anybody else, so just stay where you are. So blitus is that sticking out, there's this notion, all these words have this element of like putting yourself forth and like inserting yourself into making yourself a protuberance, right? Like sticking out, all of that. So making a name for oneself is the same idea, right? And what they were building a tower, right? A tower is like expresses the same idea. The Midrash tells us, Tana Rabbi Yishmael said, Ein Shem El Avodah, that a name, what does a name mean? It means idol worship. It means idolatry. To have a name means to make a name for oneself, to make yourself as this separate entity, to be, to hyper focus on your individuality to the point of ego is all idolatrous. It's all undermining your consciousness that that there's nothing else besides God, that God is everything, right? The same way, like we were talking, how anger is also idolatrous, right? Because anger is the process in which we feel like I had a plan and my plan was the plan. And now God's plan took over my plan, so I'm angry, right? That's why the Talmud tells us that it's akin to idolatry. That ultimately, what was the great sin of building a tower, right? It doesn't seem like they did something so terrible, but what they really missed was that it was an expression of this idolatry, this expression of self-service, of self-orientation, of looking to ourselves to be a thing, to be in existence unto our own. So let's explain this further. We previously explained that from the Havaya reality, from the infinite perspective, from the infinite expression of God, there's no room for finitude, right? When God is overtly manifest as infinite, there's no room for our finitude. We get consumed as finite, we get consumed into the infinite, because infinite and finite can't coexist. That if it was just God's infinity, God's infinite expression was just manifest, there would be no capacity for there to be any type of finite realm, any type of finite world. There could be no limitation, nothing to receive the light. There could be nothing could have a relationship with God because there couldn't be anything else. Like we mentioned in the analogy of the student and the teacher, that the teacher has to employ analogies and has to employ metaphors and examples in order to convey the concept. Because if Albert Einstein were to teach a 2-year-old arithmetic, even if it was just arithmetic, it's in such a, for Einstein, it is so vastly greater in how he conceives of it, that he's not able to just give over the information in the same way it is present in his mind. The way he understands arithmetic is so much more sophisticated that he's unable to convey that to a 4-year-old in just one-to-one. But rather there has to be a series of examples and different types of metaphor and however one teaches math, right? There has to be these tools to convey the concept that obfuscate it in some way that make it accessible for a 5-year-old, right? There's a thing on YouTube you see, they have these videos where like they'll bring in an expert in something and he'll try to explain one concept to like a 5-year-old and a 15-year-old and like somebody who's studying it in university and then somebody who's like a peer of theirs, or like a contemporary of theirs, right? So, and each one is different. Each one you have to employ different terms and different modes in how it's communicated. So the same is true when it comes to how when we talk about God's infinite light, when we talk about God's infinite expression, that it would overwhelm if it was just purely infinite, if it was just manifested infinite. That as long as Havaya, as long as the infinite expression of God's essence is manifest, is expressing, there's no room for there to be finitude. We say that ultimately, we always talk about this idea of yesh ma'ayin, which means something from nothing, right? We perceive of our existence as something from nothing, that we're a something and it comes from nothing. And the classic question that all the Kabbalists ask and all the Hasidic masters ask is that ultimately, if God is the true existence, then really we're the nothing relative to his something, right? His existence is infinite. His existence is self-sustaining. Our existence is dependent. It's dependent on his existence. He's self-sustaining. So how can we refer to it as yesh ma'ayin, that we refer to it, our perspective is that it's yesh ma'ayin, that it's something from nothing? Because at the end of the day, the way we're programmed, the way we perceive our existence is we feel our own existence first. We feel that as primary. The work that we do is to try to shift some of that perspective, to recognize our dependence, that our existence is dependent and is not self-sustained, and to try to shift that perspective a little bit. But ultimately, we refer to ourselves as a yesh, as a being, as an existence, and we acknowledge that in face of God's essence, of God's infinite expression, we can't have our own sense of existence. Our own sense of existence would be totally sublimated and totally consumed in God, in deference to God's infinity. Right? That first there was God's essence and God's expression, and it took up all of space, right? There wasn't even space. It just was everything, right? We've talked about this a couple of times. This is the doctrine of Tzimtzum, which was one of the things that makes the Arizal, the Michael Jordan of Kabbalah, is the idea of Tzimtzum, that Tzimtzum wasn't really articulated. It was there in earlier generations and in earlier Kabbalistic works, but it wasn't articulated as fully as when the Arizal really gave words to it. So the concept is that prior to Tzimtzum, prior to this contraction, this God making space, making the capacity for finitude, there was the infinite expression, there was God's essence and God's light, and that took up all of the space. And then there was a contraction, there was a concealment, there was an obfuscation that created the capacity for negative space, which ultimately created the capacity for finitude. So all of that is to say that the system of concealment is what creates revelation, right? In line with everything that we've been saying this whole time. And we know that when it says that there was no place, there was no room, there was no space for finitude, it's not that we're talking about a physical plane, but rather we're saying that there was this singular reality of godliness, and in that singularity, the term that the Kabbalist uses, simple, that there was simple. It doesn't really, I don't think it conveys as much in English, but simple, the connotation is that it's not a composite. It's not of multiple components, right? It's sort of pure in that sense, that it's all God. It's just essence, right? There was no multiplicity to it. So in that simplicity, there was God and God's expression, and the process of symptom of, there was no room for space, there's no room for finitude, right? Because finitude contains within it the multiplicity, right? Once things are finite, then they're all different from one another, right? In the simplicity of infinity, it just is, right? There's just essence, there's just existence. It's within the finitude that you get this multiplicity, these shades, right? These colors and the complexity of a composite. So saying that there was no space was saying there's no capacity for the composition, for the multiplicity in the composition. Rather, it was just simple. So the concealment is all to facilitate this multiplicity. Continuing on page 224. So the capacity for finitude, for finite expression, for the composite reality, for the sophistication, all of that is born out of Elohim. Like the Torah tells us that when it says in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, it doesn't use God's name of Yud Kei Vav Kei. It doesn't use Adonai. It uses Elohim, right? The creation process in the finite sense, right? In creating the finite physical world and creating the finite physical universe, all of that is facilitated through the creation, through the name of Elohim, through process of concealment, right? Concealment allowing for definition, for allowing for multiplicity, allowing for composition. And really what it means is that Shem Havaya was working with Shem Elohim, because Shem Havaya, Adonai, is this infinite, simple, pure, and singular essence. So it is the singular essence of existence with which everything is infused, but its capacity to manifest in multiple different ways in a composite of existence, in the tapestry of finitude, that is all facilitated through Elohim. Shehu midas hatzimtzum v'ahester. This is the capacity for limitation, for concealment, for obfuscation. Shemitzamtzem ha'ar d'shem havaya u'malbish ha'ar b'kama levushim ad sheyiyas avos mitzias hayesh. That it takes this simple, this infinite, this singular energy, and it conceals it in different ways, in different modalities, and in different forms that ultimately allows for the existence of things, and ultimately even allows for the existence of things to feel their own existence, right? And this is something that is in a lot of ways unique to humans. One of the elements of us being created in the image of God means that we feel our own existence and we feel our own singularity, our own individuality. I don't think an animal has it in the same sense, right? They're more just like, they're just happy to, do whatever they do. Cows eat grass. They're not like thinking about their existence, right? They're not thinking about how did I get here, right? Humans, part of what it means to be made in the image of God is that we feel our own individuality, we feel our own existence as almost self-made. And we have to grapple with feeling self-made and realizing that we're not self-made. We think of that often as something that is to our detriment, but the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, actually identifies it as something beautiful in the human experience, in our capacity to be made in the image of God, that we're able to reflect on feeling our own individuality, getting almost a glimpse into God's essential existence and his singularity, because we can almost extrapolate from our own experience and recognizing the limitations of our own experience. And this reflects the statement from the Medrash, from rabbinic tradition, that tells us that every blade of grass has a angel, has some divine energy encouraging it to grow. The literal way it says is that every blade of grass has an angel sitting on it, hitting it, telling it grow. I think that it's I don't know why it needs to be hit, but there's divine energy encouraging growth, right? Which means that each blade of grass, and similarly, every physical thing, every created thing in this world, right, has it has a spiritual divine life source. It has a divine energy that is encouraging its growth at every moment, right? When they translated the Tanya, which is the foundational book of Hasidic thought, when they translated it into English in the 50s, so they submitted a copy of it to the Rebbe to look over, to edit, to make sure they were on the right page. So they would do it like chapter by chapter or whatever section they were working on. So they submitted a section that had to do with it was talking about Domem. Domem is, we talk about there being 4 kingdoms. Medaber is humans, which means speakers or dialoguers. Then there is Chayas, which is animals. And then Sameach is plant matter. And then Domem, classically we would understand, would be inanimate, right? That's how we would generally conceive of it in that breakdown in those 4 categories. So they were using the word Domem, they were translating it as inanimate. And the Rebbe kept on crossing it out, and they couldn't figure out why. Domem literally means silent. That's literally what it means. And the Rebbe said, we know nothing's inanimate. Everything has an animus to it. Everything has divine vitality to it that is being infused with it every moment. So I forget what they changed it to. Maybe they changed it to silent. We usually use it for the mineral kingdom, right? For soil and mineral and water and things like that. There's probably a more scientific term. But anyways, the point is that nothing is without divine vitality. Everything is being infused with divine vitality at every moment. Everything is being encouraged to grow at every moment with that divine vitality. And this is based on what we explained previously, which is that the creation, the existence that is manifest in the physicality, the physical world, its existence is facilitated through concealment, through obfuscation. Through the singular divine light being concealed and constrained in different ways, in different, almost like different recipes, right? That if you conceal the singular divine light one way, you end up with an ant. And if you do it in a different way, you end up with an elephant, right? And it's all just permutations of that same singular divine light, that singular divine energy. The malachim, over al yedei hamamutzim, the malachim mazalis mismaita. So through constraining it in different ways, the light facilitates, the energy facilitates the godly, the divine energy that is the source of all of the existence, facilitates there to be different things manifest in this physical world. Continuing on 225. And so the way each thing is reduced is the same way that like what it manifests as, right? And this is a very radical point of this, which is to say that Hasidus and Kabbalah sees everything as having a divine spark. Everything that exists has divinity to it, has godliness manifest in it. So ultimately, it doesn't matter if it's dirt or mud or a mezuzah or tefillin or a moldy tuna sandwich. Everything has divinity, has a godly spark that is present in it in that moment. And it is for that reason that we have mitzvahs like Bal Tashchis, like that we're not allowed to waste, right? That we have a mitzvah Tzar Ba'al Chaim, that you have to be nice to animals, and you can't cause animals undue harm, right? All of these things are part of this singular reality in which everything is a finite expression of its infinite source of godliness. Same way we're an expression of godliness, so too the chair is an expression of God. The Rebbe writes that when we walk down the street, we have to think about Torah. We have to think about our relationship with God. We have to think about the world that we find ourselves in that is being animated by godliness. And if we don't think about God, if we're thinking about something else like baseball, then the stones say, "Who are you to walk on top of me?" Right? They take issue with us. They look at us with envy that we're able to realize godliness, that we're able to have this sophisticated relationship with our Creator. And they're just stones, right? But they also have an element of divine consciousness because they're infused with some type of divine reality, some divine energy as well. So if we're going throughout our day and we're just living in our dog-eat-dog rat race world, then the highway gets mad at us for treading all over it. So we have to have that sensitivity, even just how we walk down the street, right? All of that is part of developing that divine consciousness. So some things have more godliness. Some things, the godliness is more, it's less obfuscated, right? Tefillin or a Sefer Torah, those things are holy things that we actively perceive their alignment, we perceive their divinity, right? So much so that we don't bring them into the bathroom, we don't put them on the floor, things like that, right? We're sensitive to their outward expression of divinity. And there's other things where we don't see so much divinity to it, right? A moldy tuna sandwich, we're generally not so sensitive. We usually just throw it out. But the fact of the matter is that all of existence is sourced in the same place, which is God's infinite singularity. Because the Shem Havaya, this singular infinity, this simple essence is the source of all of existence. The Havaya l'sabas gam Matthias Yash Yor by or Havaya and it's rather that it is because Havaya is in its simplicity, cannot bring forth finite, multiplicitous composite existences. So therefore, Shem Elikim is the way that is facilitated, and it sort of creates these different recipes to make these different physical entities. But it comes out that the main thing is that all of it is an expression of God's infinite light. And it is the way it extends, the way it is pulled out, the way it is drawn out to come into physical form. That is all facilitated by Elikim. To the point where there can be physical things that extend, that are an extension of a infinite source, right? That Elohim is the Elohim reality does the impossible, which is taking an infinite source and drawing out of it or extending out of it, containing it within a way that there can be physical things, physical finite things that you can have from infinite into finite, which is otherwise a quantum leap that is impossible, that is impossible to bridge. The gap's impossible to bridge. But that's what Elikim facilitates, and that for us, the reality is always, or the consciousness is always to elevate our sensitivity, to sophisticate our own sensitivity, to realize that if Elikim is this system that is obfuscating and constraining in such a way that there can be physical, that there can be finite, then that means that we don't relate to physical and finite things as their own entity, but rather we push ourselves, we try to develop that sensitivity to perceive everything as having this divine spark, this divine source, and each thing being manifest that singular essence that is God. To the point that when the Baal Shem Tov, when the founder of the Hasidic movement taught about Hashgacha Pratis, about divine providence, and about godliness manifest in this world, he would say that the way when a leaf falls off the tree, it's divinely ordained, right? It's part of Hashgacha Pratis, which was a radical thought relative to basically 2,000 years of how we previously understood Hashgacha Pratis, how we previously understood divine providence. And what he said was that at its core, the leaf is an expression of God, and the street is an expression of God, and the wind is an expression of God, and all of this is godly in its source. So it's really God's singularity interacting with God's singularity, being pushed along God's singularity by the wind of God's singularity. And all of this is singular. It's one essence that is just presenting in different finite composite forms. But when we shift the perspective to realize that it's all God all the time, so then we live in a different reality. We live in a different world. We live in a world of beauty. We live in a garden. So Chaim, thank you everybody for coming. We should feel a little more sensitive, especially in this hard time, in a time where we feel really undermined and really challenged as Jewish people. We should know that what it means to be a Jewish person is not just that we wear funny hats or that we have a funny book, but rather it's a holistic system of living in a godly garden, in a divine garden. I put out there's pamphlets for our Kabbalah course that is starting October 31st or November 1st, October 31st at night. I think we're going to start at 8 p.m. and on November 1st it'll be during the day. It'll be at 12:30. So feel free to take one, and we'd love everybody to sign up. It's going to be really excellent. It really speaks to a lot of these concepts in a taking them head on, as opposed to when we learn these discourses, we sort of whatever concepts present, we just sort of address them as they come up, But this is a very systematized way to go through all major Kabbalistic concepts. It's a really good, there's no background in Kabbalah required. It's a really good way to sort of build a foundation to continue a study in Jewish mysticism. So it's 6 weeks. I'm very excited. It's going to be really good. Yes.